On this episode of FieldLink, we catch up with Elizabeth Burns-Thompson from Gretna, Nebraska, representing the Modern Ag Alliance. Elizabeth shares how this coalition of over 100 organizations advocates for U.S. farmers to ensure that they have access to crop protection tools they need to maintain a robust and affordable food supply. Plus, Jody Lawrence joins us from Nashville to discuss how the current government shutdown is impacting the commodity markets. Stay tuned for this episode of FieldLink. And welcome back to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith. We have a special guest joining us here today. We're at the CPDA and Crop Life Convention in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And joining us today on this 101st episode of FieldLink podcast is Elizabeth Burns-Thompson with Modern Ag Alliance. Elizabeth, welcome to the FieldLink podcast.
Thank you so much. Podcast doesn't look a day over 10 or 20 or whatever, but pleased to see you reach that milestone and be part of moving it forward. So happy to be here today.
Oh, it's awesome. And, it was great catching up with you at the conference this week. And we're learning more and more about Modern Ag Alliance and some of the things you do with the Modern Ag Alliance. But hey, listen, before we deep dive into Modern Ag Alliance and some of the things that you work on, let's talk about Elizabeth. Where's home? Where'd you grow up? And how did you get here today?
Sure. So much like many of your listeners, I'm from agriculture and have had the great privilege of being able to keep that with me throughout my professional career. So my family is harvesting right now as we speak. We farm just north of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, so eastern Iowa. Okay. Corn and soybeans there, as well as we say commercial cattle just because, nothing's purebred. We got a lot of black baldies. My dad just happens to enjoy those. But my career has taken me quite a few different places, and I actually live just outside of Omaha, Nebraska now. So I am still a very proud Cyclone alum.
But you went over to God's country, right?
I have jumped the border, we'll say, and gone west. And I have credit to the state of Nebraska, have loved my time there. So still in the Corn Belt, still very much in the heart of ag country. But yes, have throughout my professional career have had the great privilege of working predominantly in the commodity space. So when I say that, I mean actually the commodity association. So I have been in the policy world for pretty much all of my career. So like I said, a proud Iowa State Cyclone alum, went to Drake in the Des Moines area, got my law degree, and knew I wanted to do, policy work for farmers. And so have worked with the Farm Bureau at the state level, spent a handful of years with the Corn Growers Association, then jumped from there from kind of the world of ethanol to the side of biodiesel. So have been in both of the fuel tanks for some space in the biofuel space, and then worked on some carbon development projects before joining the initiative here at Modern Ag earlier this year. So I am closing in on 9 months, starting month number 10 here with Modern Ag. And it's been an exciting first few months, and very proud of what we've been able to accomplish. And I'm sure we'll talk about that as we get into the weeds here.
First off, what an awesome journey that you've had, growing up as a farm kid in eastern Iowa and traveling out and really working in all sectors of agriculture, from policy, from Farm Bureau, as you mentioned, the ethanol side of things, biofuels, and now Modern Ag. Okay, our listeners may or may not be familiar with the Modern Ag Alliance. Tell us a little bit about Modern Ag Alliance.
And rightfully so. What was really unique about what drew me to this opportunity too is this is a new organization. And what I would say is somewhat first of its kind in that my members are trade associations, commodity groups, retail entities from all across the country. So my list of members, which folks can find on our website at modernagalliance.org, is everywhere from coast to coast, everything from corn and soybeans to canola and sugar beets and potatoes and strawberries and you name it, the list goes on. We have this wide swath of organizations that came together really with a laser focus of ensuring that all of these industries continue to have access to crop protection tools. And for those that may not know, crop protection is just a sexier word for saying pesticides.
Exactly, yeah.
And so we work each and every day to ensure that not just in the heart of corn and soybean country, but really all across the U.S., that agriculture writ large continues to have access to those critical chemistries.
And clearly, there's always modern agriculture has a target on its back, especially kind of in the environment that we're dealing with right now. We'll talk more, I'm sure, about the moment and all that sort of thing. But, pesticides as a whole can have a dirty word in some circles, but Modern Ag Alliance is really trying to change that analogy, if you will.
Absolutely. So when I define kind of what we work on in any given day, I'd say about half of our portfolio of work or responsibility or tasks are advocacy. So working directly, with lawmakers, predominantly at the state level. I spend bulk of my time. We were part of legislative initiatives in about 12 different states this year. So that's a lot of time away from home for myself, but certainly a lot of different, advocacy environments in a lot of different state houses. The other half of that is just issue education. So we proactively are out there. We buy billboards, we buy social media ads, we are doing campaign work. We're working with our partner organizations like the commodity groups and ag-retail entities in each given state to stand up campaigns for a Joe Public focused education about the importance of these tools, what they mean for farmers' effectiveness and productivity, and connecting those dots to showcase what that ultimately means for the consumer. Because surprisingly, we have found actually that the public understands that the productivity of the farmer and the success of the American farmer is directly tied to our ability to put food on the table, fuel in our tanks, fiber on our backs, and you have to start with that foundation in place in order to then do policy conversations. And so those two avenues are incredibly important, kind of different audiences, obviously from lawmakers versus Joe Public, but both of those work very much hand in hand for successful policy initiatives and working towards a good regulatory environment.
And I think it's really important, and you kind of touched on it, to be aligned with the rest of the industry partners, because ultimately we have some similar goals, don't we?
It is. And while there is certainly folks in agriculture, and we had a speaker here at this conference this week that said something about, I've never met someone that I agree with 100% of the time. I've also never met someone I disagree with 100% of the time. Right. And so we are always going to have things, even within the small group that we are in agriculture, where there's disagreements on the how or the where or the when. We are swimming the same direction. And so we do try to pull that together. And I think that's what's unique about this coalition, is that it showcases just how important crop protection, chemistry writ large is. And it's not just in one person's backyard or in one state or in one time zone. It really is agriculture all across this country. And it's a challenge that we are facing everywhere. So just to show the gravity of what we're working on. And that's something that we're communicating to lawmakers, but also, Joe Public.
Elizabeth, there's a lot of chatter in Washington as well as at the state level right now on glyphosate. Let's throw that out there. Everybody's talking about glyphosate and hydrous. I mean, these are really important products that have been a part of agriculture for 40, 50, 60 plus years, and they're at risk today in a lot of cases.
Yes. In fact, we were talking before we came on here about what's the one thing that I think, we hope listeners take home with it. Just to be straight with them is I hope that people understand that there is a real threat to the availability and continued access to chemistries moving forward. You may be able to buy the products you needed for this growing season, but the regulatory environment, the challenges that we see on the horizon should put us all on ease. And so we are trying to go out and do some proactive work, play some offense. Let's not wait until we lose products. And it's not just one active ingredient, be it glyphosate. What we are concerned about, and I think what my members and that broad swath of ag recognizes, that while glyphosate is the one that's got the target on its back, kind of at the forefront right now, we do truly feel that becomes a bellwether. If we lose that active ingredient because of what has transpired over the last 10 years, that has just set up a playbook effectively for those that are actively working against production agriculture. And they now have a playbook exactly of how to go in and take off every other critical chemistry that we depend upon. And that's looking backwards, right? That's only looking at what do we lose in terms of what we have today. We're also taking into account, what type of just a chilling effect that has on the industry of ever getting any new technologies coming to market,
moving forward.
Exactly. And we already know that it's a slow process. It's a slow slug. I think last data points I was seeing or was given was like 12 years. It takes from the lab to kind of the field gate of a product, to move through that regulatory
to get a molecule
process.
Or whatever, a technology to move forward through the process.
Yes. So 12 years. And an average investment of about $300 million. And those are averages, right? So that means there's some out there that are taking longer. There are some out there that are taking less in the investment. But that's a huge hill to climb the uncertainty that exists from the regulatory environment that we are trying to solve for will only make that worse if we don't, play some offense and get some resolutions in place.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Elizabeth, you talk about groups like Modern Ag Alliance, taking the story to the public, taking it to Congress, taking it to the state legislators to tell our story in agriculture of the importance and the value of these products and how they really impact production.
Mm-hmm.
So moving forward, what are some tactics? What are some things? How is Modern Ag Alliance really trying to translate that message that you talked about to the public and to the market?
Sure. So probably more focused in on kind of the legislative tactics that where we've been playing a little offense or I shouldn't say a lot of offense. We referenced those 12 different states where we were part of legislative conversations earlier this year. Very proud to say that we got 2 of those across the finish line and signed into law. So farmers up in North Dakota as well as down in Georgia appreciate those that were part of helping advocate for that initiative. But in all of these states, we're working towards the same goal, which is consistency and clarity around the label. Many of your listeners, I'm sure, are farmers. Many of them probably have their applicator license or certification. And those that have gone through those trainings know that there's something that is just beat into them on repetition.
Right.
And that is the label is the law. The label is the law, right? And that is at the core of exactly what we are working towards from a legislative perspective, in that consistency around health and safety provisions around the label is so important. Right now, if you are a manufacturer or registrant and at the state level, you are tasked with putting forward a sufficient label that has sufficient warnings and sufficient information. The way in which you satisfy that could potentially look different from state to state. And that's concerning, especially when you have lawsuits that transpire as part of that, which is what we have seen come out of a lot of the glyphosate or the Roundup litigation that I'm certain everyone has seen some type of late night commercial or TV ad,
sure.
Call this number, get, your settlement now type of a thing.
Get rich quick.
Yes.
Hey, exactly. Call 1-800.
And that is almost entirely predicated on the question of what is a sufficient label. And so all we are trying to do and working towards at the end of the day is to go in and work with the lawmakers to say, this is how a manufacturer satisfies their duty to warn and puts forth the sufficient label. And they do it by getting a label that's issued by the EPA, which is what they're doing right now.
Correct.
They're just unfortunately, and I'll make a little bit of a lawyer joke because I am one, so I think I'm entitled to.
You can go there.
They've earned it over the years, but lawyers have made this unnecessarily complicated and complex. And we sit now in an environment this has become a multi-billion-dollar problem for the industry, and it is only going to continue to grow if we don't get this very simple clarification codified into law. We're working on it at a state level right now, in part because much of these lawsuits and litigation is originating out of state law. And so that's why that's necessary. But you had mentioned Congress and working in DC. There are some avenues where we're working with Chairman G.T. Thompson on the House Ag Committee, as well as others, as do we get a farm bill that feels a little bit like a Groundhog Day type thing? We are now 2 years into extensions of farm bills. So I am optimistic that we're going to get one done. I don't know if it's the 25 or maybe the 2026 farm bill, but pleased to hear leadership continue to echo that clarity and this consistency around pesticide labeling is a top priority. In fact, it's within that top 3, according to Chairman Thompson.
And clarity and consistency is a really important thing. And just to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper, there can be some interpretations different from state to state and how they interpret some of these labels and how legal action can happen, I don't know, a little differently, maybe in California versus New Jersey or versus Texas. And that's really confusing for producers, isn't it?
It's not only confusing for producers. So agriculture is due, as farmers and applicators of these products, we're entitled to consistency and clarity around it. But we also can't lose sight of the fact of that trickles down to the consumer, right? If there's uncertainty as it relates to what is safe application of these products and how do you utilize them safely, and there's somehow shades of gray in terms of how that's interpreted, then how do you as Joe Public consumer have assurances when you walk into the grocery store and you're consuming these products that there isn't shades of gray in that respect too? And so we're just trying to, at the end of the day, clarify that there are not shades of gray when it comes to safety. That's uniform. It doesn't know state bounds. Something is just as safe in the state of Texas as it is on our farm in eastern Iowa, as it is in western Montana.
Sure.
It might be used in different climates on different crops and in different environments or growing regions and things like that. But whether or not a product is safe is something that is uniform, and that should be recognized as such.
Well, and I think you bring up a wonderful point when we create that confusion, when that confusion's out there and puts that uncertainty into the consumer's mind, it opens a Pandora's box for confusion and risk and this whole, I guess, free flying narrative of what this pesticide or this product may or may not do, and creates confusion in the marketplace.
Absolutely. And I'm always been a big believer that like perception is reality.
Mm.
And there is a connotation, we spend a lot of time talking about the word label.
Right.
We know labels are robust. When I go in to talk to, many state lawmakers or the general public, I see the word label and I think they think about, the side of the Coke can that's sitting in
Right.
front of me or the side of their food box, right? Something that's very simple and easy to navigate. We're talking about when we're talking about pesticide labels, that's effectively like your permit to operate, right? When you get a label, that
Correct.
is your registration to be able to bring a product forward, and they're incredibly robust. So I think that's also an exceptional learning curve that we have to overcome, is being able to explain the depth and breadth of what goes into labels and how closely those are followed. Especially, that's why our partnership with some of the applicator community is also
Mhm.
incredibly important when we're having those conversations to say, and we've gone into some committee hearings, printing off labels that are 20 and 30 pages long to say, this is the depth of what goes into them, and the scientific analysis that goes into it. And just to build off of that even further, we don't just add something to a label as a nice to have or a feel good
Right.
either. Everything that is encompassed into that label has some type of justification, scientific backing, purpose-driven piece, right? There is no word added to that label on accident or just as a feel-good factor. And so I think that's another piece that's worth kind of taking a step back of how we got into this situation. And another thing, if to leave listeners with, if there's something to take home, this is a big one. We sit in a situation right now where you have the trial community that has basically told agriculture, we are going to continue to sue you until you add disclaimers to your label that your products cause cancer.
Right.
On the other side, so call it rock hard place, whatever you want to call it. So you have on one hand that, on the other hand, you have a regulator, the US EPA, that says, we don't just put things on labels as a feel-good factor. Everything that's on a label has scientific justification, and there is not science to justify to say that something causes cancer. And so that's why we will not allow it. In fact, they went so far as to say that we won't approve product labels with that claim on them. That'd be deemed misbranding. And those that followed, that's not just a term that we throw out there willy-nilly. That's
Right.
actually a critical term of art. If something is misbranded, your registration is voided. So your product doesn't come to market.
So I think that's a really important point for our listeners and producers out there and employees, that things that are on the label, it's not marketing.
Nope.
It is not marketing. It is scientifically backed truth in this case. And that's what you're advocating with the Modern Ag Alliance, to talk about the truth in labeling. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Truth, consistency, and clarity in labeling. And we don't want to get to a point where we just throw things on a label
Yeah.
that don't have a scientific backing or a reason why, because that becomes a really slippery slope then.
Sure.
And frankly, that's not what we've done in any type of labeling dynamic to date, especially with pesticides, where the label is effectively like the regulatory clearance, the registration of the product, the depth and breadth. And so the problem itself is pretty simple when you boil down to it. It's amazing it's grown to what it has, but and unarguably, the solution is very simple. In fact, I was hoping I still had a printout of one of our bills. Our state legislation that we have worked on thus far is very simple. In many cases, it's one page, because it is just saying that a manufacturer continues to have their duty, right? They still have a responsibility to warn and put forth sufficient labels. But how do you do that? Well, you go through the EPA process.
Right. The EPA process, it's a process that's been put in place for a long time.
Yes.
And is really effective. I mean, there's hoops in there for a purpose. Right?
Yes. And it's not a standalone process. I think what some
Right.
people think about too is, well, once something, is on the market, it's on the market. No. The renewal process for registrations, which is at minimum every 15 years. In many cases, these products are being reviewed more often than that,
Right.
as science continues to evolve and new things come forward, that these products are re-registered, re-reviewed. And they're not only just in this country. I mean, keep in mind, many of the active ingredients that we're talking about and looking at and using in this country that are registered in this country are also being reviewed by regulatory agencies around the world
Globally,
as
correct.
well.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
And you said something very powerful. This a renewal, usually a minimum of 15 years. It is. Hey, listen, as a consumer, that's important. That should send a confident message to the average consumer who's consuming these products, because we're saying as science evolves, we're getting better.
Mhm.
We're learning more about these products and how they work, and maybe some of the challenges with them. But that should be the reassurance to consumers that the EPA is reviewing this information for the greater good, correct?
Yeah. I mean, science is not stagnant, technology is not stagnant. So neither are our review processes, right? And
Right.
that's why it's so important that not only that there's that consistent process of relooking at it, but I think another kind of additional nugget that I'd add on top of that is because this review is done by the EPA, it's actually an open process.
It's
So
an open forum.
anyone can provide comments. I mean, if you
Right.
think about just recently, I think the EPA had an open docket for the new registration for dicamba, or
Yes.
any new AI that's coming before them is part of an open process for public comment. That's part of our regulatory
It's part of a
procedure.
democracy,
Yes,
really. Open
exactly.
comment for the people, correct?
Yes. So it's not such that you need to have a PhD after your name in order to have a voice in what the EPA looks at as well. And so they are required to look at feedback writ large and science writ large, and not just at one point in time, but on a continuous basis.
Elizabeth, you said something very powerful earlier about, I'll call it the audience, in this case, lawmakers.
Mhm.
Taking something extremely complex like a label and breaking it down. You referenced, hey, we took this at the state level and made it into one page. It's important to break complex things down to the simple fact, but really backed with a lot of science like you've outlined here for the EPA.
And I've always been a fan of trying to tackle misinformation right off the bat. And
Right.
so, be it taking something that a federal regulatory, program like FIFRA, another acronym that is probably foreign to many folks.
The
But
world
for
of acronyms in
yes,
this industry is crazy.
isn't that the truth? So we used to have a contest of how much of a sentence you could write with just acronyms. I can't
I,
remember what the record is.
I'm stepping back in time. Back in the 80s, I worked on a software platform, and we actually published all of the acronyms in the Department of Agriculture, and it was somewhere around, I don't know, 20, 30,000 different acronyms out there, and it was a Bible, if you will. It was crazy, and they're not going away, by the way.
No, they seem to only get even more intense. In fact, just AI in and of itself, depending on what audience you're in, I was talking to a cattlemen's group, and AI sounds a lot different for that audience
Sure.
than in the chemistry industry, where AI means something very different.
Artificial insemination, right?
Yes. So we've got AI from livestock, we've got AI from chemistry, and then AI from a tech sector. And we just came out of a session about communication, and I think that hits really home about trying to
It totally
tailor.
does. And it's funny you bring that up, because we at Helena, we had to rebrand our agri-intelligence platform, because for 25 years we've called it AI. AI stole our acronym. So here we're having to reinvent ourselves again. So you're so right. Words mean things, and communication is so critical. So, Elizabeth, as we kind of go through this journey, what are some things that growers that are listening out there, and even some of our employees and other partners that are listening on this, how can they get involved with Modern Ag Alliance and make their voices heard and make an impact?
Sure. So one thing that we haven't gotten into in great detail yet, but we'll just kind of graze the surface of, is on top of all the state level work that we've been working on, we also had this MAHA.
Oh, yes.
Which, for those that haven't looked up, yet another acronym to add to the list, is the Make America Healthy Again initiative, or commission of sorts, that has really grown out of the federal level, obviously, with some of the members within the current administration campaigning largely on that and building up some of that. I anticipate that to be pretty transformative in our state legislative sessions come 2026.
Mhm.
And I lay that groundwork in one part because we saw some challenging things come out of the first wave of MAHA work at the federal level. For those that were following, there was an initial report that came out earlier this summer. It was extremely challenging for production agriculture, especially for pesticides. In fact, it went so far as to name specific active ingredients in that report. By the second report, that the tone and tenor changed, and I will say that I believe that the voice of the American farmer was heard by
Yes.
those that were involved in drafting those particular strategies and recommendations. What I am concerned about is that there's going to be some trickle down of what we saw to that first report show up in state legislative conversations come January of 2026. So I give that long background to say it is as important now and than ever that farmers are out telling their stories and building relationships with their lawmakers, especially at the state level. We have such a diminishing amount of folks that are stepping up for public service that have any amount of background in production agriculture. There's just an exceptional learning curve. In fact, we were sitting in some meetings earlier at this conference where a gentleman, I believe from Michigan, noted that there is only one member of their state Senate that is a farmer right now.
Wow.
And I think he's term limited, if I remember right. So they are slated to potentially have 0 farmers in one of their chambers moving forward, which is incredible, but is also, I think, a trend that we are going to continue to see in other places. So for those of you on here that are listening that have, maybe an inkling to step up and serve, maybe chase that rabbit hole a little bit and see. And
we need folks that are involved in production agriculture to fill those public service roles, whether it be at a state level, as a senator or, even a local council person.
Yes.
It's so critical.
Yes. But even if you can't take the time or it's not the right, time to give that level of service, it is so incredibly important that you are viewed as a trusted resource for whoever is the decision maker in those roles, and that you are, providing that information for folks that are ultimately going to make these decisions, because they are going to get information from another side of the coin that doesn't understand agriculture and has a very different viewpoint of how we should farm and why we do what we do. We have some challenges ahead of us. And so from a communication, I believe, only works if the relationship is the foundation. And so the best way to be able to advocate is to start with a relationship. And that necessarily needs to start before we get into legislative sessions. If you're going out there and trying to introduce yourself while also making an ask of someone, that's no different than the guy that's, the cold sales call. No one likes that either.
I mean, this politics a little bit in getting initiatives like we're talking about over the finish line. It's a little bit like dating. You've got to ask for the first date before, you advance to the next stages in your relationship.
Yes, it's a relationship business, and that's a good thing, right? I've spent a lot of my career working directly with farmers in some of these commodity associations. Kind of, how do you navigate being effective in these environments? And you've made it when that legislator calls you before they go to Google, that you've become their Google in that respect, right? If they've got something that's before them and they don't really know, they've got to gut check it, and you're the one that they gut check it with. You've really made it. You're that trusted resource. And that's really what I encourage folks to try to get to be for some of these lawmakers, or as many of the lawmakers as you can.
Well, Elizabeth, you bring up some really good points at the state level. We really, we get a lot of noise at the federal level, right? Everybody, you turn the news on, you're hearing a lot of it. I will say, from my far distant seat on the bus, it feels like at the federal level, at least with the current administration, they're listening. I'm not saying they're going to do everything we say, but it feels like they're listening. We've got to also, as an industry, carry that message to the local state levels so that we're kind of replicating that same type of message.
I think the goal of some of these initiatives, or most of these initiatives, is good. We've shared values, shared goals. We're trying to get the same direction. It's ultimately the tactics or how we get there is sometimes where there's a disagreement, or the implementation of something isn't right. So, for example, I think the underlying goal of making our country healthier again is good. I think everyone can agree.
Everybody's got to live. We all have families. We want it to be right.
Yes, but under that same MAHA movement of sorts, we saw things come out this legislative session that would have required food packaging to list glyphosate or atrazine as a food ingredient. And those were labeled as pro-MAHA bills, right? Under the same umbrella of movement towards health and safety. I think our members would not agree that listing a chemistry used in production agriculture as an ingredient into a granola bar or,
It's
your
really not an
cereal. It is
ingredient.
absolutely not an
No.
ingredient. And it flies in the face really of all of the regulatory process that goes into ensuring, from be it FDA, EPA, and USDA, that are ensuring that things are used throughout the production practice, are in safe quantities at the
Sure.
end, food product. And so I think that's where more effective communication about what we do, how we do it, and most importantly, why we do it, can help stave off some of those things that have good intentions, but really are maybe just bad policy proposals.
Right.
Because we're gonna have some of that coming into 2026, in addition to some of the offensive work that we're going to continue to put forward.
It feels a little bit like, the emotion is kind of sidestepping the science in a lot of cases.
In certain cases, yes. And I think, just to reference back, we just walked out of a seminar about
Right.
brevity, and science is not known to be brief.
Right.
I come out of the legal community. We're not known to be brief either,
Right.
even though they call them legal briefs, which is kind of an irony. You've got to be able to explain, the why. And I say why, starting with why, because that's what gets someone to understand why I should pay attention to the rest of it. Right?
Why is it important to me?
Why does
Correct?
this? Yes, exactly. And
How
so,
does it impact me?
exactly. And so back to, I think, where we started is that bridging that gap, or helping that understanding of the productivity, the effectiveness, the safety that happens on our farms is directly related to the productivity and, longevity of the general public. And so those are just building bridges where we've unfortunately as a country been pulled very far apart.
Well, we're definitely polarized, and to your point, we've been, I guess, somewhat victims of short messages. Our attention span as humans today is way shorter than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. I mean, one of our speakers today talked about 26 seconds. We've got 26 seconds to get our message across, and we better be really on point. And it's hard to get complex messages like labels, like we're talking about glyphosate, in 26 seconds to the average consumer. It just doesn't always happen. We've got to figure that out as an industry.
Right, exactly. And so, what I would task farmers with is kind of a take home, is to understand that, don't take for granted what you have today. We need to continue to stay involved we don't want to lose products. We don't want to lose headway. We want to, and we need to continue to educate and advocate for what you do, how you do it, and why you do it. And when we start getting into some of these proactive policy proposals, you've got to step up and advocate. You've got to reach out and have those tough conversations, in some cases, and that's how you build bridges.
Yeah. Elizabeth Burns-Thompson with the Modern Ag Alliance, I want to thank you for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink as we dive in on some of the initiatives that you're doing as a Modern Ag Alliance and how you're bringing value to the farm gate and helping to ensure that we have some of these awesome products that help us produce more food and fiber, and we're feeding and fueling the world.
Absolutely. It's been a great honor to be on here with you today, and I'm pleased with the partnership we continue to have with Helena and all of your growers all across the country. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith, and joining us from Nashville's Jody Lawrence. Jody, hey, we're getting ready for the field market report here, and we're into, it's approaching another week of government shutdown, and it's certainly having an impact with several agencies, specifically USDA, on some reporting, and it's kind of slowing things down and getting us some harvest progress reports. Jody, welcome to FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, the government shutdown certainly has cut down the list of topics that we can talk about with any certainty at all. We can guess just by the way the basis levels are around the country and how good the weather has been for just about everybody, to the point where everybody would probably rather have a lot of rain, get a good bit of rain, because it's so dry in the Eastern Corn Belt. But we are expecting, if we could find out a number, that harvest is roughly 65 to 70% complete on beans and pushing 55 to 60% on corn. And with a big crop, especially one that is going, a lot of it is going to need to get that moisture draw down so there's no dock. I've talked to a lot of producers leaving it in the field while the weather forecast is favorable for dry down, to save some money, which makes complete sense. And while the yields have been really variable, last week's USDA report that was not released, the numbers were still everybody's estimates, and there's no point even really talking about estimates. They were below the USDA August, but still in a range at 183 to 185 for corn and 52 and a half to 53 and a half for beans. That we've got, that would be another record, especially for corn, and we would have a lot of extra bushels to do something with.
Definitely going to be a lot of crop out there. And Jody, you're right. Across much of the U.S., we've had pretty darn good harvest season. There's been some spots getting a little bit of rain, but boy, oh boy, overall, good progress from north to south, east to west for sure.
Yeah, and it's a testament to how hard everybody is willing to work. It's a tough time. We're not going to try to hide from it and make up positive things that, silver linings that just aren't there. But you look at how hard everybody works all season, and then they get to this point to bring in the crop that you do have. I'm certainly not going to call it depression, but when you look at prices and everything, there is a very high level of frustration in all the producers that I talk to, because they've done another remarkable job. And unfortunately, just the dynamics of the market currently aren't there to help them really capture the potential out of this crop.
So, Jody, just a little before the government shutdown, there's been a lot of chatter, a lot of discussions, announcements by President Trump and the Secretary of Agriculture about having some relief from some tariffs. There was some progress certainly being made. And then we come to a government shutdown held up, at Congress. Jody, from what you hear with your sources, what was some of the conversations going to happen? How were some of those payments going to be deployed?
The early indications were that the program is going to be very similar to what happened in Trump's first administration. So the industry is kind of working off a $12 to $14 billion budget on this. And at the time, it was far more bean specific as far as the size of the payment per bushel, because of China's undue influence on the bean market and on bean prices. So we don't know we don't know the breakdown on any of it, but we have a general idea that it will be very similar to last time, from a 12 to 14 billion dollar payout. And before this, it's not been talked about since the shutdown, other than, hey, we're still working on it, is that we've got to get everybody back to work. You have to have the USDA and then the FSA and all the trickle down. And for this relief package, even if the tariffs have brought in 50x what President Trump is saying he wants to offer to the farm community, the Congress is still going to have to pass it. And they're in such a contentious battle right now. I can't imagine, especially when you talk about cutting government agencies and balancing budgets and all the things everybody is fighting about, against each other and inside their own party, that when we get back, everybody just comes in, votes unanimously to send $14 billion out to the ag community on what a lot of people, both Democratic and Republican farmers that I've spoken to, and people who are certainly involved somewhat in the process of it, is becoming more and more of a self-inflicted wound. So I'm optimistic he will follow, that President Trump will get the USDA to follow through on this, and Secretary Rollins. It's, to me, the whole thing is all about timing, and the first domino that has to fall is they have to reopen the government.
Yep, that's going to be the first step for Congress to stack their hands, vote to open the government and pass, legislation to move forward in order for the next step to happen here in terms of these subsidies and support payments for sure. Jody, anything else going on around the globe as it relates to the grain markets today?
Now, all the bearish factors that we've talked about are still in play. Russia has way too much wheat and they still have to find a way to finance the war. So they're selling it as cheaply as possible. Cheap wheat always bleeds over to be a drag on corn. So there's another problem with the corn market, is that wheat is historically low in a historically large amount. And you've got South America's planting and early growing season getting off to a good start. Perfect mix of sunshine and rain in almost all areas that have been able to, that are planting currently. So it's been very challenging to dig into the limited amount of news that we do have and find something really optimistic. And if President Trump, because now we're really on the clock after last Friday's, we're done with China, there's no point talking to him at APEC, to yesterday's tweet that, hey, and apparently a lot of substantial talks between Secretary Bessent and his trade counterpart in China. And that's why everything except our markets rebounded so strongly today. So in 2 weeks, today's the 13th. Yeah, within 2 to 3 weeks, we'll have U.S. harvest just about complete. You'll have most of South American planting, certainly past 50%. Hopefully we'll have the government reopened, and then we'll be able to catch back up on reports. And if we get positive news out of that APEC meeting in South Korea, and China does offer, an olive branch of buying a bunch of beans, then we'll have a different outlook than we do right now. But the murkiness of the water is just impossible to predict anything.
Jody, it just certainly feels like more than ever, global politics are certainly impacting, growers here at home, probably more than ever.
Yeah, it is not. It's certainly not just a domestic market. When, and this goes all the way back when, Bill, you and I were little kids, when President Carter basically weaponized wheat,
right,
in the Russian embargo and the things that happened there. It's food and energy are, right there is the key points of leverage, unfortunately, in a lot of political negotiation. And we're in the industry that's right in the middle of it.
That's right. Well, Jody, I want to thank you for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink, and we look forward to catching up to you in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, Bill, thank you. Everybody stay safe on that last part of harvest.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to subscribe to the FieldLink podcast so you never miss an episode.